Yes, my research topic is critical sexual theory and postcolonial studies, assessing disability policies and the narratives of women with disabilities in Nepal. I got interested in this topic for three reasons. First, my master's degree was in women's studies and my thesis was on women with disabilities. Second, I work as a residential manager for an organization that work for people with disabilities, and that gave me an opportunity to listen to the disabled. And third and final, I'm originally from Nepal. Nepal is a patriarchal country where sex before marriage is considered taboo, and that tells how sex lives of women with disabilities might be affected. So being a student of public administration and policy, I thought it is important to research disability policies and how these policies addresses sex and gender lives of women with disabilities. The empowerment of Nepali women is associated with their ability to get married, and which is possible only if they are beautiful, able, and rich, who can afford a dowry for their husband. Even after they get married, whether they can deliver a baby or not, preferably a son, also determines their empowerment. On the other hand, if they are disabled, they are considered to be unable to fit in that category of being beautiful and able, and therefore they are deemed asexual and unable, and then they do not fit in that normative standard of what or how Nepali women supposed to be. So the need of the research is there is a Nepal's constitutions, there are different disability policies, and also CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the need of the research is how these policies addresses the gender and sex lives of these women with disabilities in Nepal. One of the objectives of public administration is to serve the marginalized. So being a student of public administration and policy, it's the need of the hour, it's the need of the research, whether or not these policies serve the marginalized conditions or the sex lives of these women with disabilities. So the purpose of the studies are to explore the meaning of disability and gender policies, to analyze their literary works, and also to analyze policies and see if these policies addresses the lives of women with disabilities. To make this research easier, a typology of narratives is proposed, and this typology is categorized into 4 different categories: intelligible, observational, heterogeneous, and reflexive. Reflexive is the 4th category, where does lie the locus of the research, the main focus of this research. So whether or not there are policies that addresses the heterogeneous issues of women with disability is a main question that this research focuses on, and how these heterogeneous issues are reflected in policies. So my research questions are there clear Nepali disability policies that addresses sexual marital lives of women with disabilities? What are the life stories of women with disabilities? And how do disability policies reflect on narratives of women with disabilities and their sex and gender and sexual orientations? To answer this question, I have used critical sexual theory and post-colonial studies framework. Critical sexual theory is a critical theory substantiated by Foucault's biopower and biopolitics. Here, biopower means how power is imposed upon bodies, and it discusses the techniques of biopower such as sex, gender, and disability, and how they are used to suppress and achieve the subjugation of bodies. Similarly, I have used post-colonialism framework. This is an academic approach that utilizes the techniques of colonization such as renaming, redefining, and controlling, and how they are used to suppress the marginalized body and then their consequences. I have used narrative method because the narrative method in my research is very important as it is useful for data. It is an important policy tool and it values personal stories, without this method I would not be able to explore the narratives of women with disabilities. So it helps me generate more ideas about their life stories, and therefore I thought I would be able to find the gaps and policy mismatches if there are any. So I have used Richman's narrative method and Barth's structural analysis of narratives. Richman's narrative method just talks about 4 different types of analysis: thematic, structural, dialogic, and visual. I have not done any visual analysis because I don't have any pictures and visuals to analyze. Thematic analysis discusses in terms of main ideas and themes, which helps me understand the stories of disabled sexual lives in common and what are the differences and what are the major themes that their stories deal with, their lives deal with. Structural analysis is the place where I have used Barth's structural analysis, which helps me understand the meaning between signifier and signified and how meanings are made in different contexts and what disability or sexuality means in different contexts. And dialogic and performance analysis, where I have discussed different ideographs and metaphors and how different symbols and metaphors meaning in terms of the choice of words, and that that's what I have discussed in policies and narratives, women's narratives, disability narratives. I have used NVIVO word clouds as a qualitative software to run word clouds of different narratives. I ran a word clouds of Nepal disability policies, and it brought the results with an emphasis on people and disability in a more singular form. Then after, I ran a word cloud of CRPD, Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. It emphasizes basically the same words, disability and persons, but in more plural form, disabilities and persons. And then lastly, I ran a word cloud of women's narrative, which the result came out completely different from the rest, because it highlighted heart, love, life, and society, and even sexuality, which already gave me an idea that there does exist some kind of gap between policies and women's narrative. So I further did a thematic analysis between 2 different narratives, policy themes and narrative themes. So it also shows completely 2 different opposite themes. I mostly focus on 3 different themes in these 2 different narratives in terms of opinions of social bodies versus voices of the disabled, rehabilitation versus emancipations, and safe motherhood in terms of delivery time versus motherhood in terms of love, sex, and marriage. So these 2 different narratives shows 2 different perspectives, and that came out to be just opposite. Similarly, I did another analysis, which is a structural analysis between 2 different narratives, and this also brought 2 different results. Policy narrative emphasize social bodies, emphasizing the organization's opinions is more important to understand the lives of people with disabilities, whereas women's narrative emphasizes disabled bodies, where disabled bodies experience is more important to understand the disabled lives. Case is more physical, whereas case is more emotional and psychological in disabled women's narrative. Similarly, hysteria for disabled women in disabled women's narrative it has something to do with sexual ability, whereas this idea of hysteria is considered taboo under policy narratives. And again, safe mother is discussed in terms of delivery, while disabled women's narratives, motherhood discusses sex and marriage, motherhood in terms of sex and marriage. And the final analysis I did is a dialogic analysis in terms of the choice of words that have used in different narratives. In policy narratives, cripple, disability, rehabilitations are used, whereas disabled women's narrative utilizes mental wounds, unbutton the blouse of love, guinea pig. So here cripple has something to do with paralyzed, handicap, paraplegic. Disability has something to do with the idea of inability, disorder, dysfunction. Whereas women's narratives, mental wounds is defined in terms of even if they are physically unable to give birth to babies, there is a creative way of giving birth to creative genres. They talk more about sexual ability in terms of rather than inability and disorder that has been highlighted in disability policies. Rehabilitation has something to do with cure, healing, and improve, while disabled women's narrative emphasizes, how their bodies is colonized and they remain as guinea pig. So with that said, finally I came up with the results, or the results that I came up with. I plugged that back into the typology which was proposed previously. So it showed the result that we don't have such policies. We don't have such policies we call reflexive policies that addresses the heterogeneous issues of women with disabilities who have a lot to discuss about love, life, sex, and other heterogeneous issues. So policies do not seem to be effectively addressing the gender and marital issues, the sexual issues of women with disabilities. And it feels like it requires a separate gender sexual policies which can address the sexual lives of women with disabilities. So with that said, the conclusion is still there does exist gender policy. Sexuality seems to be compromised because of that idea of taboo in the policies, and the women's narrative shows that we have alternative narratives. They have come up with alternative narratives which policy needs to recognize. So, thank you.